When I first saw the Retroid Pocket Flip be announced, I got very, very excited. I had been tempted on numerous occasions to purchase a Retroid Pocket 3 or 3 Plus, and this thing just took it way over the top for me. I don't know what it is about that form factor, but it got me very, very excited to try it out. So I purchased one literally like a couple of hours after it became available for pre-order. I've had my indigo color Pocket Flip in my possession for several days now, and I'm ready to give you guys my full thoughts on if this thing is any good. Before we jump into it any further though, let's take a look here at the actual listing for it on GoRetroid.com. This is the Pocket Flip. It is $164. Of course, there are some different prices for the different colors. If you go to black or the 16-bit or indigo, which is what I have, you're looking at $159, of course, plus shipping and taxes if they're applicable to you. As far as the specifications go, we have two Hall effect sliders. That's awesome, which means you're not going to have any issues with drift over time. They are both clickable with L3 and R3. We have active cooling. There's actually a fan inside this device, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Analog triggers means they're not just position 1 and position 2. They have varying degrees, which can be useful for racing games and things like that. There are two programmable buttons on the back that you can use for anything. You do actually have double injection molded ABXY buttons. Those are your face buttons. And basically the big takeaway here is that the paint will not be smearing off onto your fingers or wearing down. It's actually part of the plastic itself, not paint added on at all. You do have the Unisoc Tiger T618 processor, which is fairly decent. We've seen it in other handhelds already. GameCube games are going to be not totally playable, but a lot of GameCube games are going to actually be playable on this processor. That's about the upper limit of what this thing is going to be capable of. 4 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of eMMC storage. Not the fastest in the world, but for this, it's going to be just fine. A 4.7-inch touch screen, which runs at 60 hertz and 450 nits, 750 by 1334 resolution. So not too bad. It's like a little bit better than 720p. In terms of brightness indoors, it's totally fine. 450 nits though. When you're outside, there's a lot of reflections going on. It might be not the best thing to use outside, but indoors, 450 is going to be totally fine. Of course, it is running Android 11, which is a good thing because it opens things up to a lot of possibilities. Anything in the Play Store is pretty much usable at that point. 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and then, of course, the ability to be updated over the air. So let's quickly go around the hardware, and I'll point out some things there as well. So first off, I just want to talk about how this thing actually feels whenever you're holding it. It is a lot chunkier than I thought it was going to be. Like, obviously, I had seen the pictures, but when I first took it out of the box, I was kind of surprised about exactly how chunky of a device it is. I will say that it's not super heavy, but it does feel substantial enough that overall it has just a nice, solid kind of feel to it. This does not feel like some cheap, flimsy piece of tech. It feels like a fairly high-end piece of hardware, something you would buy from like a major console manufacturer. You may notice that this color, this indigo color, does pick up fingerprints just a little bit, but not as bad as some of the other colors. So let's talk about the array of buttons here a little bit. You have your A, B, X, Y buttons like I mentioned earlier, and there is a decent amount of travel to them. Let's see if you can kind of visually see what I mean. Not too bad at all. They're not clicky. These definitely feel like a membrane, as does the D-pad, but I think that they feel pretty good. The sliders were something that I really wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but actually playing some, believe it or not, some shooters on this thing, it's really not bad. And then in any kind of like 3D platform or something like that, they've been quite solid as well. I'm pleasantly surprised by these sliders, and the fact that they're actually clickable for L3 and R3 is really cool as well. And that allows this thing to fold down. With a joystick, that's going to be pretty hard to pull off. With the sliders, that's going to be doable. So that's why they made that sacrifice. And honestly, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. I'd mentioned that the shoulder buttons actually can do varying levels. So not just, like this button here is either not pressed or pressed. This can actually detect different degrees of how far it is actually pressed, and that is pretty good. We do have stereo speakers down here. I mentioned in my unboxing that I thought that that was the speaker and that these were vents, and that this is where this would be like an intake and that would be the exhaust, but actually it's backwards. This apparently is the intake and these are speakers. So the thing that looks like a speaker is not a speaker. The things that look like speakers are in fact grills for the intake. That is quite strange. I do wish that the screen could bend back just a little bit further, okay? Like, I wish it could go back just a couple more degrees from where it is, but it's comfortable for the most part. When you're holding it like this, it pretty much is facing you dead on. I just wish I had a little bit more flexibility, and it will stay at pretty much whatever angle you put it at. So you can get comfortable anywhere. You just can't go back as far as I was hoping. In terms of the speakers that I talked about earlier, since this thing runs Android, we can do something that's quite cool. We can just go into YouTube Music and play a song, and you can hear exactly how good or bad these speakers actually sound. Let's move the microphone a bit closer. We're going to go maximum volume. And for a terribly unfair comparison, here is my S23 Ultra. I don't think I'm telling any lies here. The speakers are not great. They're decently loud, but they're pretty forgettable. I did mention that there's a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and it does okay in terms of battery life, but I would almost suggest putting this thing into battery saver mode because, like, you know, what are you doing that you're going to need the sorts of things that battery saver actually restricts, right? So you might as well just turn that on and really improve the battery life. In terms of charging, I was getting about 0.4% per hour. And I was losing about 5% per hour just in standby, not with battery saver turned on. So battery life and charging is decent. I also want to mention the fan that I talked about earlier. You can actually go into your quick settings here and turn that fan on into a balanced mode, a smart mode, or a performance mode. In performance mode, I want you to hear how loud this fan actually is. I'm assuming that is absolutely audible, and in fact, it's audible over your games a lot of the time. So keep that in mind. The good news is, I really can't tell any sort of performance improvement you get from having it on in the first place, so I'd probably just leave it off for the most part. So I mentioned earlier that there is the ability to do video out. I did not actually have a micro HDMI, but I did have an adapter, and that adapter is now plugged into my large TV in the living room. And that is working pretty well. So if you want to use this thing, I can't even get back far enough, as like a proper console on your television, yeah, you could totally do that. So with a console like this, I'm not really going to waste your time by showing a bunch of older consoles. We know that they're going to run, okay? NES, SNES, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation 1, all of these things are going to run absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to show you a couple of GameCube games and then a Wii game to basically demonstrate what the upper end, the outer edge of this thing's performance capabilities actually are. Now, in these tests, we are running the Dolphin emulator, but it's actually one that this thing downloaded. It's based off of Dolphin MMJR, and it allows you to do some extra things quite easily, like lower the internal resolution to get better performance, and that's going to be necessary in some of these games. So the first one that we're looking at here is Mario Kart Double Dash, again on the GameCube. And I believe on this one, I'm sitting at like 70% internal resolution, totally flubbed up on the start there. But once you get going, and I believe you can see in the top left corner, my frame rate is quite high. This is running really, really well. Totally playable. This is not a game that I played a lot of. I'm a big Mario Kart fan, but I did not play a lot of Double Dash. It took me a while to kind of get the feel for this game again. It had been a little bit of a time since you can see there drifting into the walls and so forth. But once I got the hang of it again, this felt like playing Mario Kart, and it felt really, really good. Absolutely solid gameplay for this first GameCube game. Now, this next one is actually Metroid Prime, and this one really struggled a lot. I tried to do as much as I could to make it run better, but it just remained rather stuttery and difficult to play. I can't imagine this being something that anybody's going to actually want to sit through and play. It's close at times, but it's just not quite there. It's just not quite playable for me. Different things you do just really create stutters. Going into the morph ball mode, tons and tons of stutters. I can't imagine that when you get into more complex areas, it's not going to be even worse than that. Now, the next one that actually surprised me was Wind Waker. This is running really, really well, and I've actually got everything pretty much maxed out. Did see a couple of stutters here and there, but I could easily lower a couple of things and make this run even better. Wind Waker might be totally playable all the way through. Now, of course, those later dungeons do get pretty hectic, and it could cause some frame drops for sure, but I think given how strong it is at this opening area, pretty strong chance that this thing could be playable all the way through if you do lower some of those settings. Now, this next one is Mario Galaxy on the Nintendo Wii. This one actually ran surprisingly well, and a cool feature of this is that with a touchscreen, you can simply reach up there and do things like the Wiimote could have been doing with your finger instead, and that works really quite well. Now, there were some drops here and there, but nothing that made this not playable for me. Running around this planet, chasing the rabbits, all of that good stuff, working surprisingly well. Now, you are going to have to do a little bit of extra work to map all your controls correctly. A lot of these emulators work straight out of the box. Wii was a little bit weird. You got to go in and customize some things. But once you do, even a game like Mario Galaxy is running way better than I expected it to. Now, there's another thing you can do with this lovely little handheld that I don't think many people are thinking about, and that's actually game streaming, whether that is with Xbox Game Pass or with Moonlight, and I've got a couple of good examples of both. So what I'm doing here first is playing the latest Hitman game via Xbox Game Pass streaming. And as you can see, by doing this, the visual quality that I'm getting out of this game is something far beyond anything else you could play natively on it, whether this is an emulator or an Android game itself. Now, I know a lot of people hear game streaming and they assume that the latency makes things absolutely unplayable, and depending upon your network connection, that may absolutely be the case. However, with my network connection, Hitman was relatively enjoyable. It's a slower paced game, and that actually helps quite a bit with these sorts of things. If you're playing a fast paced first person shooter or some sort of, reaction time based platformer, then yeah, you're going to have a probably pretty bad time. But if you're playing something slower, a turn based game, or even something like Hitman, I think this is a pretty valid and enjoyable way to play these games and to potentially play games that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. And like I said, Hitman was a lot of fun. I played this opening mission and had no trouble with it. Even taking aim and firing a shot there at the end was pretty easy and intuitive here. Now, another way you can do this, like I said, is streaming from your own home computer through something like Moonlight. And Moonlight offers a far lower latency experience. You can see here playing some Rocket League, exactly what I mean. So I jumped into just this first training area and watch how quick it is. When I hit that A button to jump, to make my car jump, do you see how low that latency is, how quickly that actually does respond? This did not feel like I was streaming anything. Even with Hitman, as good as it did feel, you could tell at times there was a little bit of latency here, and they actually handed the console to my wife and said, would you, if you were playing this, if I just handed this to you, would you guess that this was streaming? And she said, no, probably not. But playing Rocket League over Moonlight was even a step better than that. So if you've got a decent gaming PC at your house already, this thing could be a pretty nice remote play device for your already existent PC. Now, of course, Android itself has a ton of games as well. As you can see here, we're playing PUBG, and we are actually using some built-in software to map controls onto the touchscreen. PUBG Mobile does not have controller support, but you can give it controller support, which some might argue gives you an unfair advantage. So, judge that however you deem necessary. But you can see as a proof of concept, any potential game that has on-screen controls, you can then map to your physical controls and make that a much better experience. And then, of course, there are games like Minecraft that do natively support controllers. I'm in quite the troublesome area right now running through all these enemies, but there are games like Minecraft that do natively support controllers, and they're going to work pretty well on this thing as well, guys. If you want a little portable Minecraft player even, this thing would be, you could definitely do worse than what you've got here as well. Honestly, my favorite thing about this device is probably the fact that it runs Android. Now, not everybody's going to feel that way, but for me, It's familiar, and it's just an open way for me to get whatever I want. Other people might say, well, you can do this, that, and the other thing with these Linux firmwares, but I'm not familiar with Linux firmwares, and most people aren't either. If I grab one of my other retro handhelds, of which I have several now, and gave it to my little brother, the speed with which he could like irreparably break things would probably be very impressive. There's so many weird little things that even I don't know what they mean, right? But with Android, we're all pretty familiar with Android at this point. The Play Store is there. It's cool. It's just open. Like, I can install whatever I want on this thing, and I think that's a really big advantage. Although that Android experience is not totally perfect, they do have something in the quick settings here, which is called Force Landscape. And I'll show you kind of what your two options are. So let's launch something like YouTube, right? You can install YouTube. That's pretty cool. Well, if we're here, it's just so short, being 16:9, that you can't get a lot of stuff on screen. Now, this thing actually can rotate. Auto rotate can be turned on, and you can use it like this. And that's a really weird thing that you can do, but it is definitely maybe better for some apps that just don't work well flipped around this way. Now, some applications simply refuse to run in landscape orientation, and that force landscape option will make them do that. But a lot of apps that you might install, like let's look at the Play Store, like it just gets really scrunched up and difficult to navigate. So Android is cool to have, but on a 16:9 screen turned sideways, it's not the best way you can experience Android. Because I forgot to mention it throughout the course of the video, the home screen you're seeing there is actually a third-party launcher. I'll drop a link to it in the description if you want to try it out. It's just the one that I ended up preferring. There's one that's called the Retroid launcher that they have, and it's okay, but the beautiful thing about Android is you can install whatever launcher you want to use, whatever you're comfortable with, and just roll on from there. So there you go, guys. Those are my thoughts on the Retroid Pocket Flip. I will drop a link in the description down below. If it is ever available on Amazon, then you see an Amazon link down there. Assume that's an affiliate link that will help support the channel. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more content just like this. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.